The goal, start a business that you can spin up in relatively short time to replace your income and surpass your income, and then something that you can scale without your direct input eventually. Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Better Outcomes Show. I'm your host, Rafi Salazar with Rehab U Practice Solutions. And do you want to differentiate your healthcare technology, your device, even your business from competitors in your region or in your industry or in your sector? Do you want to align your solution or healthcare service with your targeted healthcare buyer? Or do you want to create a consistent message to drive business in the form of qualified healthcare leads? That's the key, right? Qualified healthcare leads. It doesn't matter if you get a list of 100 people if only one of them is interested in what you've got to offer and ready to buy. If the answer to those questions is yes, that's great. That's awesome. The question that should come after that is, how do you actually develop a strategy that drives those qualified sales conversations for your organization? If you ask me, if you listen to the show for any length of time, you know that it all starts with what we call positioning. Really, what you want to do is you want to be able to answer that question, value to whom, in order to develop an effective value proposition. Different stakeholders or buyers in healthcare will determine what they consider valuable and the outcomes they seek from healthcare services or solutions or technologies based off of where they are in the healthcare ecosystem, right? Payers consider some things valuable that providers actually think are not valuable, and vice versa. Patients in the same way. By narrowing down the value to whom question, you have a clear idea of how your technology, your device, or your healthcare service is positioned to solve the problems faced by your targeted healthcare buyer. And if you're wondering how in the world do we do that, we've got an answer for you. It's called the Healthcare Positioning Alignment Workshop. In that 90-minute workshop, you'll sit down with me, my team, we'll figure out that value to whom question for you and your organization. We'll put together consistent messaging so that you're able to drive those qualified leads, and we'll even arm you with a little bit of information about how to manage the sales conversation. If that is something that you are interested in, you can check out the Positioning Alignment Workshop at positioning.rehabupracticesolutions.com. That's positioning.rehabupracticesolutions.com. Learn more about the Healthcare Positioning Alignment Workshop. Or just shoot us an email, info@rehabupracticesolutions.com. We'll get you the information, get you set up, have a call. It'll be awesome. Alrighty. This week on the podcast, again, it's just me, solo. I'm messing around with this format, and shoot me an email, shoot me a note, whatever, if you like it, if you don't like it. Basically, here's what I'm trying to do. The whole reason I started the show back in the day, 4 years ago, was really because it gave me the opportunity, the podcast gives me the opportunity to have interesting conversations with people doing innovative and interesting things in healthcare. And I enjoy those conversations. I enjoy that format a lot. I really, really enjoy sitting down with an expert who is far and away more versed and knowledgeable about a topic area than I am, and then getting to learn with you in live, right? Live without a net, as a former business partner of mine would say. I really like that format. However, I've been getting a lot of questions, a lot of emails, a lot of feedback about positively about doing episodes that relate specifically to healthcare business, entrepreneurship, operations even, healthcare technology and the business of healthcare technology because of some of my work. And I figured the best way to do this is to vary up the episodes, to have some, a fairly consistent portion of episodes being these interviews with people that I just want to have conversations with, and you can come along for the ride and learn. And then episodes like this, where it's topical in nature, and I kind of dive into maybe some brainstorming or some thinking about an idea as it relates to healthcare business. So if you like it, let me know. I'd appreciate the feedback, and we'll kind of make adjustments accordingly. So this week, instead of having an interview, we are diving into the topic of healthcare businesses, and for clinicians in specific, and things that prevent clinicians from starting businesses, some of their aversion to risk, and some ideas that I think are 3, 4, maybe 5 ideas of businesses that can be started with very little risk, very little upfront capital and input, but still provide the ability to scale and ability to replace income. So this all started because another PT in the interwebs, Anthony Meritato, he's been a guest on the show before. He had a poll on LinkedIn, and his poll basically asked, clinicians, he's a physical therapist, so specifically talking about that sector, physical therapists, borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars to basically buy a job, right? But they often or won't or they can't borrow to build a business. And the question he was asking in the poll is why? Do you think it's because they have bad credit, they can't qualify? Do you think they don't need it or don't want it? Or is it something else? He has fear of failure as the third option. I think there's a fourth option, and that is what I'll mention here is just risk tolerance. So we've mentioned this on the show before. In fact, I can't remember the guest's name. I think his name is Dr. Mike. Came on and was talking about Build My Team. A lot of his business, we'll link to that to that episode in the show notes. But his whole episode was, and the conversation that we had around building, recruiting, and hiring in a clinical team, one of his foundational principles that you have to understand where clinicians are coming from. And when he said this, it was like mind blown moment, and it totally made sense to me. He said, you have to understand that the majority of people that go into healthcare as a career, especially as clinicians, do so because of one of two, oftentimes both of these reasons combined. The first reason is that it genuinely comes from a position of wanting to serve. There's a very big vocational aspect to healthcare. People often refer to, and we've had Larry Benz on the show to talk about his book, Called to Care. They feel, people that go into healthcare feel like this is their way of contributing to the betterment of society. It's almost like an identity thing for clinicians. We are clinicians, we're healers, we're servers, XYZ. That coupled with they were either told or they intuit that healthcare provides a safe, stable, and secure employment field. I remember growing up and considering going into surgery or med school or something like that, because my grandfather was a vascular surgeon. And I remember talking with my dad about it, and he said, well, there's always sick people. There's always going to be sick people. And that adage kind of drives a lot of the desire to go into clinical practice, because as a clinician seeking safe, stable employment, the understanding that there's always going to be a ready pool of patients provides some of that security or peace of mind, right? So why is that important? Why are those two things important? Well, I think it's hugely important to understand because those two big factors really underpin a lot of the personality traits that get drawn into healthcare, right? The incentives that drive people into healthcare as a career. Basically, what it means is that a lot, now I don't want to paint with a super broad brush, but here it goes. A lot of people that go into healthcare as a clinical career, so not people that are MBAs and get into healthcare management or administration, but people that start their career as clinicians, licensed clinicians, or direct service providers or patient care assistants, something where they're interacting directly with patients. They go into that field, like I said, because they feel like it's a calling or a vocation, and they feel like it's a safe, stable, secure job. It's a way for them to do what they feel called to do in a way that allows them to provide for their families or build their financial future, whatever you want to say. So it means that a lot of these people coming into healthcare are drawn into the clinical practice of healthcare as a career, tend to be more risk averse than other professions, other even sectors or industries and professions within healthcare. So like I said, I mentioned him earlier, somebody that graduates with an MBA with the idea and the goal of being a hospital CEO is going to think about healthcare a little differently than a clinician going into the field thinking that this is going to be the way that they serve their fellow man and that it's going to be a way for them to have a safe, stable, secure job while they live out their calling. Somebody with hospital administration and like an MBA background or something like that might be more risk tolerant and maybe is more willing to take the risk into a entrepreneurship or something like that than somebody that's a clinician. So that whole piece coupled with the fact that clinicians in general have been taking on more and more student debt as they achieve their clinical license. It takes hundreds of thousands of dollars now to become in this case, a physical therapist, an occupational therapist. I know when I was a professor in an OT program, it was not uncommon for me to talk to students who would say, yeah, I've got $120,000 in debt, and I've still got another 2 years of school to go before I graduate. And to me, that's like, talk about risk reward there. Doesn't make any sense, because it's when I was going to school, let me back up. When I was going to school, I graduated with like 40 or 50 grand in student debt. Now I had to do a lot of things to achieve that, right? I was roofing, I was digging trenches for a plumber friend of mine, I was catering, I was doing all kinds of odd jobs to basically stave off having to take out loans as much as possible. I was very loan averse at the time. Still am, I guess. And so I graduated with 40, 50 grand worth of student loans. My wife graduated with 20 or 30. The key was, though, that we both graduated with less in student debt than we would earn in our first year as a entry-level clinician, in my case, school teacher for her case. So that dynamic probably, and I would not say probably, it does affect the calculus for clinicians considering taking on funding for a business, right? If you're already drowning in student debt and you want to start a business, you're going to be less apt to take on more debt if there's a risk the business fails, which speaks to that risk tolerance piece. So they're closely intertwined, I would think, that you have a generally or typically risk averse or more higher risk aversion in the clinical population, the licensed clinicians, coupled with this increasing student debt load that they're having coming out of school. And you've got a recipe for a population of people or a demographic of people that are less likely to take out funding for a business loan or a business venture because they're already carrying a heavy load burden, and they don't want to take the risk of taking on more debt that doesn't pay off in the end, right? So I think that's important to kind of lay the groundwork for this conversation, because it means that you've got a lot of clinicians, and we see this in the field a lot. I'm from the occupational therapy field, so I own a physical therapy practice, so I talk to clinicians a lot that are feeling this dynamic. They want to start a business. They're feeling burnt out in their practice, in their clinical practice. They don't own a practice. They're a W-2 for somebody. They're feeling overworked, underpaid, overburdened with administrative tasks. They just want to treat patients and express their vocational calling through their clinical practice. They don't know how they're going to do it under the current. If things keep on the same way, they feel like they're going to head towards burnout and apathy. But at the same time, they feel very, very trepidatious about taking out loans. They don't want to take out any more debt because they still haven't paid out the debt from achieving their degree. So they feel trapped almost, right? They might want to start a business, and maybe if they didn't have any debt, they could overcome that initial risk aversion to start a business, but they have debt and they're not willing to take on more. So that's the baseline in which this episode is going to be based. Like that's the context that I'm using to approach this episode. So that being said, the question still remains, okay, if you want to start a business and you want to remove and mitigate risk, how do you do that? Well, obviously bootstrapping it is the way to go. So here's my thing, and this is not an idea that is unique to me. In fact, a lot of the ideas for constraint-based games or constraint-based practices or exercises come from a fellow by the name of Blair Enns. I've talked about him before on the show a lot. Read his book, a couple of his books. Pricing Creativity is amazing if you're a business owner, and then Win Without Pitching is awesome if you're in the professional services world. He comes from the marketing and agency space, but this idea is just a universal business principle that I think applies very well to us here. The idea is let's play a constraint-based exercise, or let's play a constraint-based game. I like games, right? So we're going to do a game. It sounds better than exercise. So in a constraint-based exercise, you basically say this is the objective and this is what you can't do. These are the things that are off the table, options that are off the table for you. So here's my idea. And, reading Anthony's post or Tony's post, kind of seeing some of the responses and then thinking about this idea of risk aversion and debt load made me think about this idea, this constraint-based exercise. So let's lay out the groundwork. You're a clinician. So number one, let's put your mind in that mindset. You're a clinician and you want to start a business that leverages your clinical degree or your clinical expertise or skills. Doesn't necessarily need to be starting a practice, but that can be on the table. It can be direct clinical care, so like a practice. It can be some sort of clinical innovation, maybe. Maybe it's a device or a software solution or something. Maybe it's an infrastructure play, like a software. The idea of the people that made fortunes during the gold rush weren't necessarily the people digging for the gold. It was the people selling shovels. That infrastructure play, you're giving people the tools necessary to do their job. So it could be any of those or a combination of those things. It doesn't necessarily need to be starting clinical practice. Here's the constraint. The constraint is you can't get any outside funding for this venture at all. So no loans, no friends and family, no loans, no investors. You're bootstrapping this thing all the way. Whether it mean that you're pulling from savings to do that or you're just cash flowing it, no outside investment. The resources are coming from within your household income, so to speak. Okay. Here's what you want for the business. So that's the outcome is you want to start a business. The constraint is no outside funding. Here are your goals for the business. It's something that can provide the same, ideally higher though, because if you're going to take the risk into business ownership, you should be getting paid more than you get paid as a clinician just because of the risk reward, right? You are taking risk. You should be remunerated in the amount of risk that you're taking, right? Or otherwise it's not worth taking that risk. So it provides the same, if not ideally higher income as you could earn as a staff clinician in a relatively short time frame. So you don't want to spend 5 years in side gig mode. You want this to be something that you can get up the ground maybe in a couple years, right? Maybe it starts as side gig, but then it moves full-time quickly and a quicker roadmap than 5 to 7 years. And then number two, it can scale without your direct input. So you eventually don't want to be the person that the business is relying on to drive income, right? That means you can't be a solo clinician in a solo practice because that doesn't scale very well. If you are out sick, if you want to take time off, you're not earning money. And that is by nature, we can talk about the philosophy of business and all that. To me, that's antithetical of being a business owner. That's you essentially have yourself a job that you're taking a lot of, it's lopsided risk, lopsided chances of things going wrong for you, and not enough benefit or freedom. So the reason you choose to go into business ownership, philosophical side point here, is to earn income, obviously, but then achieve things that you couldn't achieve on your own. So for me, I'm a big fan of a business, the idea, I can't remember the book. The book is entitled A Business of One, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not saying that you need to start a business that you have multiple locations and tens or hundreds of employees working for you. It can be a single person business. What you don't want, though, is a business that requires your direct input to gain revenue. Because if that's the case, it means you essentially have a job, one, but you're taking a whole lot of risk that is really unnecessary and really you shouldn't be taking, in my opinion. I could get hit by a bus tomorrow and I want to make sure that my family's still going to get a paycheck in a couple weeks, right? Something like that. So we can talk about, and maybe I'll talk about the idea of scaling solo versus scaling with teams. But those are the two big things you want. Number one, you want it to provide ideally higher income than you could earn as a staff clinician somewhere. And then two, it can scale without your direct input. Okay? So the constraint, no outside funding. The goal, start a business that you can spin up in relatively short time to replace your income and surpass your income, and then something that you can scale without your direct input eventually. So what do you choose? I came up with, and this is harebrained. Literally like 10 minutes ago, looking at the clock, I decided I was going to do this episode, threw on the camera, and we're just rolling. Live without a net, as my former business partner and good friend Derek would say. So here's a few ideas that I came up with right off the rip that I think are very viable options that you could start with very little upfront capital, and do it on the side in your free time, quote unquote free time, and then scale into something that takes over your income. Interestingly enough, I've only done one of these. So I worked myself into a job with the consulting, but it's because I love doing that. Now I own a practice and I do other things, but consulting was kind of like, I almost took a back road into this scalable business thing, I reverse engineered. I left one job for a consulting gig, which was basically another job, built a business around that required, it still requires my direct input and advice and my brain here to drive revenue. But through that cash flow from that business, I've purchased another business. I've got my hands in other businesses. And that's kind of how I did it. But you don't necessarily need to do that. You could start with one of these ideas right out the gate. And with much less risk. Because again, if the idea is you want a safe, stable, secure income while you're starting this business, quitting your job for a consulting gig probably isn't what you want to do. But maybe it is. And if you want to learn more about that, shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to talk you through how that happened or how that worked for me. Alrighty, so the first idea I came up with was this idea of educational-based businesses. It could be an online academy. It could be CEU courses for like licensure renewal. Could be trainings of some kind. Something where you're taking your intellectual property, your unique skill or maybe deep clinical expertise, if you have deep clinical expertise, and turning that into a product that you can then sell to other clinicians, to other people that want to do or want to learn what you know, or even directly to patients. So it could be either or, right? You could create educational-based content that you sell to patients, or it could be trainings and CEUs that you sell to clinicians and clinical organizations. The reason I choose this as number one is because not a lot of us, if you're in healthcare and you practice and have practiced for any length of time, you know more than an entry-level clinician that has no expertise in your area of clinical focus. So you already have a baseline level of a domain level of expertise. It might not be as deep as you would like, it might not be as deep as your peers or other colleagues that you would consider like masters of this clinical expertise or area of practice, but it's more advanced than an entry-level person, an entry-level clinician. And the reality is, in order to sell what you know, you only need to know more than the person buying your product or your service, right? I remember, I think I've told this story before, my first course that I taught at the university when I was getting into teaching and academia was an evidence-based practice course. And we were covering a lot of research. It was kind of a blend of intro to research and evidence-based practice. We were covering, T-values, P-values, the statistics side of things, appraising articles, and then applying it to practice. And I would, at the time, so I graduated in 2012, was teaching this class, I think 2015. So I had only been out practicing for 3 years, really 2.5 years. And I remember feeling like the imposter syndrome was kicking in. I was like, man, I don't know. And one of the professors at the university kind of was talking to me as we were getting ready I was going to go to my first class. She was going to her first class. And she said, "You all right?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm a bit nervous, though. I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. Obviously, I can treat. I've been treating successfully for a few years, but I have no idea. Like, I'm definitely not an expert." And we had some faculty on the team that were like well researched. They were research faculty type people, PhDs, were doing grant funded research, like people that were way farther along than I was at the time. And still am. And this colleague looked at me and she said, "Well, I got this piece of advice my first day of teaching, and it's awesome. You already know more than they do. That's it." And she left it at that. And it's so simple, but it is so profound and so true that you know more than the people that you were selling to, or at least you should. Otherwise, don't sell to them. And the same is true of patients, and the same is true of clinicians buying training and continuing education courses and the like. You know more than them, and that is why they are coming to you. Definitely, this is easily seen with patients, right? If you're a movement expert, let's take physical therapists as an example, since this whole show is predicated on physical therapy. You know more about the shoulder complex and about the four mechanisms of the shoulder complex and the kinematics of the shoulder and how the glenohumeral joint rotates and the scapulothoracic joint does its thing than your patient does. Like, your baseline level of knowledge, even if you were very early on and junior in your career, is already light years ahead of a patient, the average patient. I did have on caseload one time a PA who was in ortho, and I was treating him for his shoulder. That was an interesting turn of events there. Anyways, so you already know more. You have some expertise, and then the goal is just putting it in a format that is consumable, that is scalable and repurchasable, and then that you can then go out and find that audience of people who are less along on their journey than you are. So in the event of clinicians, maybe you're 1 or 2 years out of practice, you want to start this business, and you have some insight that maybe a new grad physical therapist would really benefit from. Boom, that is the foundation of an educational business. The nice thing about education businesses is that they are very low cost to start up. I mean, you're talking maybe a couple $100 a year for domain and hosting, maybe another $100 or so, maybe a couple $100 for like an LMS platform. So the platform that you use to host your educational content. And you could probably combine them both. I'm sure there's businesses out there. There are platforms out there. Thinkific, Kajabi, all of those. Like, you don't even need a website. You just build everything on Kajabi or Shopify or whatever, WooCommerce, and you build yourself a really robust and sophisticated learning management system for your students without a whole lot of capital outlay. I remember starting a business, an education business that ended up going nowhere. Maybe I'll talk about that down the line, with some clinician friends of mine, some other professional services, some other consultants. And I think we spent well into the six-figure mark on building a website, building a custom LMS, building or doing the production. It was very high production value coursework, and then it didn't go anywhere. There's ways you can do it very quickly. I've named a few: Thinkific, Kajabi. I'm sure there's plenty of platforms out there that are, $40, $50, $60 a month, and that plus a $100 a year hosting, and you're off to the races. You just put the content up and you're good. And then the nice thing about that is, again, you can drive a lot of business to that for very, very cheap using things like YouTube, maybe a podcast. Podcasts aren't the best to start a business with, because you need to have an existing audience, or at least the way I've found to be successful is to have an existing audience before you start a podcast, but it's an option. So education-based businesses, number one, boom, done. Clinical learning communities. Now, this is an interesting one. They can be online or they could be in person. In the online space, you've got something, I was interviewed on their podcast maybe a year, maybe 2 years ago, OT Potential, Sarah Lyons. They're great business. It's a great business model. It's kind of like a membership site. They're providing, her bend is like taking clinical or clinical research and applying it to practice. So there's a lot of CEUs and continuing education units that she's doing. It's a membership fee. So you sign up for this subscription, and that gives you access to this content or this library of content that she's not necessarily putting out, right? She's interviewing experts. They're doing a little bit of the work on the front end, and she's tapping into their expertise and kind of packaging that up as an educational bonus. So that's one. Another thing that I think gets missed out on is the idea of community, like clinical communities. And I've been a member of these that they were actually pretty good businesses that were, call it like a monthly lunch club or weekly lunch club, not BNI, because BNI is like specifically for the purpose of referring business to one another. Of course, these medical communities could be very much like that. But this idea was, and I think we did a podcast really early on with them when they were starting it, was the idea of we're just going to have a group of local practice owners, local clinicians that get together once, I think it was once every other week, maybe once a month. It's going to be $100 a month to be part of the group. But what you were going to get basically was there was a learning component of some kind. It gave each of the clinicians or each of the members an opportunity to give like a share of their clinical expertise. And the idea was fostering relationships. Now, I don't think they monetized it as effectively as they could have, but even if it was just, there are 30 of us in the group or 20 of us in the group at $100 a month, I mean, it's not an insignificant amount of money either. And it costs very little up front. They put the group together. One of the guys was hosting it out of his office upstairs above his clinic. So there was, they were cutting costs that way. Now, eventually they grew to the point where they were renting out a facility every month, and there were evening dinners, and there were events, and they really built a community around it, which was awesome. But it didn't start out that way, and it didn't require a whole bunch of upfront capital. One of the things that I really thought was beneficial from this was that you get the benefit of being a connector if you're the business owner here in this situation, if you're the one that owns the community. I have always found and have always tried to be one of those people that just knows a lot of people, and not just for the sake of knowing them, but for the intent purpose of being able to connect people. Like, for example, one of the previous guests on the podcast runs a VC firm. One of my clients is looking for some VC funding. I was able to connect them, right? And I'm not looking for any money out of that at all, because I'm a big believer in the fact that you can have the Zig Ziglar thing, right? Like, you can have everything in the world that you want if you help somebody else get whatever they want in the world, right? And there's benefit and goodwill that comes from just connecting people, and the businesses that can grow and flourish because of that. So there's that aspect, and then there's other ways to monetize those types of businesses, right? Like, you can do educational content and charge for that. You can do events and charge for that. You can do extra things. But it's a business that doesn't require a huge loan to get started. You're basically just building your core group. And from the core group, you're building the network outside of that. And then you're dealing with a little bit of the network effect, which, if you read that book, is the idea of like, how do you get Facebook to be valuable if there's only one person on Facebook? Well, you need a group of people to make the network valuable. So you have to overcome that hurdle a little bit. But if you do, you've got something that is very sustainable and very valuable and can be very powerful in that local community. I know that there were a lot of folks in that medical professionals group that I was in that ended up starting a business venture here and there, or some kind of business partnership that greatly benefited both of their patients, because it's just they met in the group and things clicked and they were able to help each other out. They had aligned goals and incentives, right? So there's that. The third idea, so number one was an educational-based business. Number two is some kind of community of some kind. Maybe it's a membership site, an online community, or maybe it's in person in your local geographic region. Number three is an actual clinical practice that you start maybe on the side, and then you grow and expand as the cash flow allows. So obviously, this would tailor more towards those people that feel like their identity is being a clinician. They are clinicians first, business owners second. The ability to treat patients as you want to on the side to gain extra revenue and then scale that as you grow is huge. And then it also allows you to work out some of those bugs, those operational bugs, without putting all of your eggs in one basket, right? Without taking out a loan, signing a lease, doing whatever. Those things that add risk or risk factors that some clinicians may or may not consider worth taking. So those are at least the three basic ideas I came up with. Another idea was, and I was just thinking about this coming up here to hit record, was the idea of some sort of subscription based, like a newsletter type thing, which maybe falls into the community thing, the community type business or the educational business, but something where you're providing just content that is of value to an audience that is very niche, and then selling advertisements through that newsletter or monetizing it another way and then selling it. That's another one that's just popping into my head right now as I'm thinking it. So that's all I've got. Hopefully you find this this type of episode entertaining, insightful. If you want me to dive more into those, maybe we can have like a we're part of Strata Studios now. Maybe we can have like a little Strata Studios kick around, a round table with some of the other guests on there about this specific idea. Things that clinicians can do maybe in and around the practice space that don't require a lot of upfront capital and can scale relatively quickly. So there's that. If you like the show, you can head on over to iTunes, leave us a rating and review. You can head on over to betteroutcomes.show, subscribe, all of that. Really what I want you to do, though, is if you find the show entertaining and valuable, share it with a friend. Share it with somebody that you think would find it interesting and valuable. If you want to explore having me come to your event or your organization to speak or train or do it virtually, we've set up a page for that, speaking.rafisalazar.com. All the information is there. And if you want the book, Better Outcomes, A Guide to Humanizing Healthcare, go to book.betteroutcomes.show. That's all I've got this week. Until the next time, folks, be safe, be healthy. I will talk to you then.